Welcome, everybody. My name is Dimitri Roussopoulos, and I have the distinct pleasure and honor to introduce this panel of one and to invite a full discussion afterwards. It's not possible, it's not easy to introduce this extraordinary speaker that we have here today, because she has a very rich history, personal and political history, and she's also a person of extraordinary accomplishments. The occasion of her visit is seminal for us here in Montreal, because with her visit we want to create a new awareness, a new consciousness about what is going on in a particular part of the world that is interesting us more and more, and about a particular people and the values of those people. People have consistently asked me, Dimitri, of all the causes in the world of oppressed people and repressed people, why are you so particularly interested in the Kurds? And my answer is very simple. I'm interested because of what is happening in Rojava and what the Kurdish freedom movement is all about its basic values and its social, cultural, and political objectives. We have oppressed people here in this country, the Aboriginal people. We have them in Sri Lanka. We have them amongst the Palestinians. Why the Kurds? So that's my answer. My answer is because this particular freedom movement is struggling to realize a new society based upon not only social justice, but upon gender equality, upon ecological principles, upon a form of democracy that I associate with. And we use the occasion of having been here to launch this new important book, which actually we rushed to have it out here for last night and today. And after picking it up yesterday, I went home. I left while others were sitting around chatting. I went home and I picked it up and I turned to section 5 of the book, which is called Analyzing the Democratic and Federal Project in Theory and Practice. And I read it, and Havin has a contribution in that section. And then I was satiated in reading it, and so I read part 6, Democratic Confederalism and the Scramble for the Middle East. Well, I'm not in top form today in front of you because I actually got to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't put it down. I couldn't put it down. And I'm a reader. So I highly recommend that you don't leave today without one of these in your hands. What are the origins of this book? The origins of this book, which is clearly going to be seminal in the literature, is the fact that I was invited, the only North American to be invited, to be part of an international peace delegation in 2016. An international peace delegation that had 2 objectives. One was to go to Turkey and to be part of an international association of people to urge the Turkish government to undertake a peace process with the oppressed Kurdish people in that country. There are chairs here, one there and one there. That was the first objective. The second objective was to have the honor to go to Imrali, one of the islands in the Bosporus, and to sit down and chat with Öcalan, of which the book deals with at some length, and to see how he is, the condition of his health, because we're worried about that. He has been in prison for 19 years. And he is recognized as the leader of the Kurdish freedom movement. And we have to work hard in this city and this country to free Öcalan. And that was part of our mission, to urge that Öcalan be freed, because you cannot start a peace process without the Mandela of the Kurdish movement. He's often associated with that name. You cannot undertake a peace process without Öcalan sitting at the table. So we had these double objectives in 2016 when I went there for the first time. We didn't succeed in the first or second objective. We met some wonderful people, Kurds as well as Turks in Istanbul. And so we went a second time last year in February. And in that delegation, the second time around, there were members of the European Parliament and other parliaments in Denmark and in Spain and so on and so forth. It was quite an impressive delegation, again with the same objectives. And this time round, we went not only to Istanbul, we went also to a kind of urban center of the Kurdish people in eastern Turkey, near the Syrian border, called Diyarbakir. And it's a very historic city. You could check it out in your various resource center. It was quite an extraordinary experience. It's a city that is largely destroyed, the old part of it largely destroyed. Havin can tell you all sorts of things about it. At the end of the delegation, having met, by the way, one of the principles that Havin is going to speak about is the question of gender equality. Well, the city of Diyarbakir, amongst other cities where there is a large Kurdish population, elects co-mayors. In other words, every city has to have two mayors, a woman and a man. Projet Montreal, take note. And other municipal forces in this country. Always two. But these particular two were in prison. So we didn't get to see them. At the end of the delegation, to make a long story short, we met and we talked about what is our next step. And what we decided, or what I proposed, was that the report that will come out of the second delegation be part of a new book on the Kurdish question. That's the origin of the book. In this book, you find a very substantial report from the delegation that deals in an extremely documented way the horrendous repression that is going on, not only amongst the Kurdish people, but journalists, academics. You know, there are thousands of people in Turkish jails. And I don't know what you know about Turkish jails. They're not amongst the happiest places to be in. So that is the origin of this book. And then it adds a whole bunch of additional information which is absolutely vital in understanding the situation. And this wonderful person is going to lead us into a reflection, lead us into a discussion on all of this panorama situation. But the bottom line is, and you're not going to leave through that door if you don't commit yourself to helping free Öcalan and to give your best to helping the Kurdish freedom movement.
Yes. I'm really happy to be here, actually. For the past couple of days in this room, we've been discussing with many different people at different levels in trying to understand where all of us are coming from and how and why we are led into this room, what the reasons are, and how universal actually these reasons are. For the past 36 days, there is a tiny little town, it's not even a city, there's a tiny little town in north of Syria, in Rojava, called Afrin, which had a population of 200,000 before the war, with the town itself and the peripheral, which has now become 500,000 people after the war, because Afrin was actually the safest place where ISIS had not been able to get in, and therefore from the rest of Syria, including north of Syria, people had gone to Afrin for refuge. And for the past 36 days, these people are not leaving Afrin. There's a huge attack by the Turkish state against this small town for the reason that it constitutes a threat for the integrity of the Turkish state. Of course, we need to go into what this threat is. And we also need to understand that this attack by Turkey is not independent from the consent of the regional and the global powers. Everybody has a stake in it, and to understand what is happening in Afrin, we actually need to understand the history of the Kurds, the history of the area, and that of capitalist modernity. Otherwise, it just won't make sense that all these forces combined together are using all of their might, state apparatus, media, arts, culture, you know, anti-propaganda, and you name it, you know, dirty warfare, you name it. And despite that, these people, why are they resisting? Why are not they leaving? What are they doing? Maybe the story of genocide is not something new. And our story, in that sense, is so much similar, which we talked about last night, to what happened to the Aboriginals on this land, what happened to the Tamil people, what happened to Aboriginals in Australia, or in the USA, or the Quechua people, or you name it, you know. Or many peoples, now we don't know them by name, you know. Our world has in fact become a graveyard of cultures, different ethnicities, languages, and etc. But what makes actually the resistance and the struggle of the Kurdish people, both in Afrin and also in Kobani, again, another town, you know, that nobody had heard of, suddenly appeared on the radar of the world with its resistance. Because as you would remember, that ISIS was just ramming through every city that it went through. Nobody was putting up a resistance. It was almost unbeatable, you know. And suddenly we saw these tiny young men and women with smiling faces sacrificing themselves for the whole of not only Kurdish people, but all peoples there, and for the peoples of the region. And in fact, I dare say, and I claim, for the whole world, for humanity in general. For I would like you to try and think what the political geography of our world would have been if ISIS had indeed come out victorious from Kobani. What kind of a political terrain we would have had, not only in the Middle East, but as a result, you know, in Europe, in Canada, in US and elsewhere. And let me go into that a little bit more. As I said, there are overlapping situations. One situation is of the Kurds, you know, one element of it. And that is to say, since World War I, Kurds just like other cultures or ethnicities, have been struggling with the establishment of nation states. There have been attempts to annihilate, to wipe them. Ethnic cleansing has been the theme in almost all the states that Kurds were colonized by. And as I said, this is not a very unique story. This is a story that many different peoples have actually lived through. And Kurds have been in active resistance ever since then. There has been several different, of course, resistances. There has been feudal ones that are represented, let's say, by the KDP, or what we call the Barzani, the political party represented by Barzani or Talabani or others. There has been also more modern ones in terms of embracing Marxism, Leninism, national liberation movements, being inspired by them, like the Vietnamese national liberation movement, or the struggle against apartheid, and all of these things. And so for the past 45, 50 years, the Kurdish freedom movement, which began, what we call PKK, and the leader from the beginning, from a group movement, was Abdullah Öcalan. They began in Turkey. They began trying to resuscitate Kurdish people, because there's actually a physical grave that has been established, and it's called the Kurdish people are buried under here. There's actually there was a physical space like that. And so the resuscitation of the Kurdish people have been very painful, because it had almost reached the point where they had accepted this non-existence situation. They had begun the period of auto-assimilation, because the future was bleak, If, despite all the attempts, educational, etc., violence used upon you, no future out there for you, so all of these elements coming together, if you still escaped the trap and you still wanted to declare that you were going to continue to be what you are, then would come in the punishment, the violence into play. So Kurdish people, however, had lost the century where most of the national liberation movements had come to an end, So it was basically just the Palestinians and the Kurds left without actually coming to a conclusion on that facet of the struggle. But I think what is more important with the Kurdish struggle is that almost no one took notice of it. With the Palestinian struggle, there was much support around the world for many different reasons. But with the Kurdish freedom movement, what we are seeing is that there was almost no one supporting it. That includes the Soviet Union. That includes Cuba. That includes, the traditional supporters. That includes China as well, So therefore, and of course, the fact that it was divided between four parts in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria, and the dogmatism of real socialism, where saying that you're Kurdish meant that you were automatically nationalist. Some of the Turkish left in that sense, back then, actually did a lot of the anti-propaganda as well. To say to the Kurdish people, oh, who cares, we're all workers. Oh, actually, they turned around to us, some of them, to say, you're not even workers, actually, you're peasants. So therefore, how can you be socialists?
Most of them, not some.
So they had this linear understanding of how things were. So in fact, what you found was that for everyone, you were the bad guy. For everyone. For the left, you were nationalist. For the nationalist, you were communist. For the communist, you were, nationalist, whatever. So you were like everybody's agreed, non-existence and should not exist component. So therefore it was amazingly difficult to navigate through all this, you know. And of course, seemingly, it was these 4 countries that colonized us, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. But when you dug deep, it was actually a scheme of capitalist modernity. They were just, Öcalan says, the guardians of this. You know, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And of course, they've done their fair bit of share. It's not to make them, you know, all clean or whatever. But what I'm trying to say is that capitalist modernity places everyone and everything into such roles that if you don't step out of it, all you do is to repeat it, you know. And I think Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom movement, as a result, had the chance to think deeper because nobody supported them, right? So when nobody supported them, they were able to see every ideology for what it is, you know. So they didn't have a blinded approach to it. So in that sense, it was very illuminating. It was very difficult, but it was also very illuminating because you had no privileges, you know. It's usually the privileged that don't see the truth for what it is. Because they have their privileges, they don't want to give up, you know. And so this is one aspect, you know. And of course, the final blow came in 1998 when Öcalan was forced out of Syria. And let me tell you that Öcalan says, when he evaluates those days, he says they wanted to interfere and invade the Middle East via us, you know. By creating a never-ending war where the Kurds would be just, you know, like explode themselves in this city and that city in rebellion, you know. And then Öcalan stopped this, of course, at a time when everybody expected him to act in a different manner. After he was abducted in Kenya and taken to Turkey, and at a time the reaction of the Kurdish people, both in 4 parts of Kurdistan and also around the world, turned him from a political leader of PKK into a national leader. Majority of the Kurds embracing him and actually stopping the plans that, you know, NATO and Turkey might have had for him. Even I remember Madeleine Albright getting up at the time saying we never expected such a reaction from the Kurds, you know. So, and then, of course, Öcalan came into the scene in his showcase trial on the island of Imrali, and he proposed a project, and he called it Democratic Republic. So instead of what Turkey was trying to do, what the forces, the global forces were trying to do, create this civil internal war, Öcalan again drew attention to ideas and how to resolve the problems at hand, you know. And of course you may remember after that what happened. In 2001, it was the invasion of Afghanistan. 2003, it was Iraq. And this kept on going. And ever since then, there has been several attempts to redesign the Middle East. And the reason is very simple. In fact, there is a third world war going on. Wars will not be the same as the wars before. It's going in terms of its own dynamics. Capitalist modernity is in a huge structural crisis. And what will come out of this chaos and crisis, it depends very much on how we struggle within this period, not later, not 20 years later, not a year later, but today. And the way that this war is run is in such a way that it's sometimes very difficult to bring the dots in, you know, to put the dots together to understand what is going on. Because if we look at Mexico, if we look at what's happening in most of the Latin American countries, we are seeing that it's cartels, you know, it's land grabs, you know, it's done in a different way. In a different way, people are removed from their land, you know. If we look at Africa, for us, most of us, Africa is maybe barren. I mean, there are so many people in camps who are, you know, without good drinking water, without food, and etc., you know. And then, of course, we are seeing how things are handled in some of the countries, like for example, Libya. Look at what happened in Libya. You know, Libya was plundered, and it's still being plundered in the name of, you know, intervening in the name of human rights.
Democracy.
And it is still not together. And there are huge war crimes that are happening over there at the moment, you know. And of course, the same is true for Iraq. I mean, look at what the situation in Iraq is, Afghanistan. And this is where the importance of Rojava and the ideas of Öcalan comes in. They wanted to do what they tried to do in 1999, they tried to do it, you know, in the last couple of years in Syria. And what the Kurdish people did, who have embraced the ideas of Öcalan, is to say, okay, we're not playing this game, you know. You're not going to benefit our grievances from our grievances and base yourselves upon this, you know. And for us to fight a war that is not benefiting neither the Kurds or any other people. So this is why the Kurds did not fight neither the Assad regime nor other forces. They said, this is not our war, this is a game. We're not playing this game because people are not going to benefit from this. And we called it the third way, you know. And for a long time, the world ignored us. Mainstream media, everybody ignored us. Some said, oh yes, you know, they are acting with Assad regime. I mean, Rojava didn't become like this the moment it became, because, you know, it didn't fit into any category. And we'd love to put things into categories. You're either pro or against Assad. Well, why should I be? You know, I am there for a set of principles, right? We reject the Assad regime because not only for the Kurds, but for all the peoples, it's not a democratic regime. And it has ignored the Kurds. You know, there was no citizenship. There is huge human rights violations that went on, you know, etc., etc. I don't want to get into the, you know, the bits of that. But so what I think, how I want to live, you know, what I think is the mechanism to strengthen the tendency for freedom, okay? And this is based upon the ideals of Öcalan. And Kobani, let me tell you, did not resist all on its own. Did you know that the very first place Öcalan went to, just before the 1980 military coup in Turkey, was the town of Kobani, because that is the border. He made the crossing from Suruçin to Kobani, and this was the very first place in Rojava that he stayed for many months, and he organized firstly there. You know, so it is no wonder that these people there resisted immensely. And their resistance was not due to the fact that they had extreme weapons. You know, it was their ideals of life that made them resist. Because we have a huge saying in Kurdish, Berkhodan Jiane. We say, to resist is to live. To live is not to resist. To resist is to live. And therefore, this has been the motto of the Kurdish people, especially with the modern or the contemporary resistance and struggle of theirs of the past 45 years. And so these were the paradigms that were at war, you know. We are actually going through a period. Actually, I've been saying this for a while, and the other day I heard that the Turkish state is saying this one as well. That really, I mean, it's interesting. I've been saying that this is more like just before World War I, you know, because it has a potential for everything, you know. It has a potential, just like, you know, how the Soviet communes came out at a place where nobody thought they would pop up, you know. And so Rojava is like that as well. Nobody had hopes for the Middle East. I mean, you know, it's so backward and all. This is how it's ingrained in us, that it would come up with such ideals and such a ferocity to defend these ideas, you know. So therefore, there's still a lot of resistance and organized resistance in the Middle East, in the personage of the Kurds. And this resistance is now tried to be broken by many different forces in many different ways. So ISIS was then directed on this third way. I mean, suddenly they left everything and they started attacking the Kurds. And Turkey had a huge hand in this. They trained the ISIS fighters. They sent weapons there. They brought them into Turkey to, you know, for hospitals and stuff like that. And so money, you know, whatever you like, intelligence. So, and those people, like even journalists, even Kemalist journalists who tried to expose this, were either put into prison or they had to flee the country. And the reason why I say the Turkish state also says, like it's World War I heard the other day that a high official has said, for us the Second World War has finished, but the First World War hasn't. And Erdogan the other day made a statement saying, Turkish Republic, Turkey, is the continuation of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, there are lots of things at stake here. I mean, the US is no longer the world hegemon. And this is why it's so much like the First World War. The world hegemony is up for grabs. And everybody sees this as a means and way to do what they have been wanting to do. This is the time not only for potential freedom, but for potential genocides. Because nobody is going to hold you accountable for it. Because everybody is doing it in one way or another. And the reason why everyone is so compliant when it comes to Afrin, and the difference between Afrin and Kobani, is that in Kobani they use the proxy, ISIS. But in Afrin, everybody is down there themselves. And I was just saying today, I think, that Turkey has never left anywhere that it has annexed. Cyprus happened just in 70s. You know, Hatay, Iskenderun, they've never come out. In South Kurdistan, in north of Iraq, they have bases and they are not coming out of there either, you know. And of course they are saying that after Afrin it's, you know, Minbic, it's, you know, they are drawing again the Ottoman borders. Have they got the depth or the seriousness to do this? Let me tell you, no. They neither have because Ottoman Empire at the end of the day, before it became corrupt and all that, you know, great deals. Yeah. It's just for us, the people, to think that there's a problem up there somewhere, you know. And so everybody uses this situation as it fits and benefits them. I think if we don't see the situation like that, if we do not see, just as the name of this book, Your Freedom and Mine, how this is connected, how the struggle of the Kurdish people over there is slowing down the creeping of fascism where you're living. You will not be able to understand how all this is connected and how the solidarity is not just helping us, but the solidarity is in such a way that we are out there, you know, by demanding as people that there's a stop to this. And this comes through organization, of course, you know. And the way they are doing it, of course, is to apply in two ways, either extraordinary violence, for example, like in Turkey, in north of Kurdistan, in the Kurdish areas of Turkey. They applied extraordinary violence, and it wasn't just physical, it was psychological as well. They applied violence and extraordinary violence at a very mediatic level, and they made everyone a part of it. And I think this is the worst. They did it alive. People who were burnt in houses talked over their cell phones to television stations, and people just listened to them. And so they've got a, you know, two birds with a stick, you know, because when you don't get up and do something about this, what will you get up and do something about for? You know what I mean? So you got a conscience, and then you got a thing like, if I haven't gotten up for this, I won't get up for this, or that, or that. So in fact, what they are using is this violence and dehumanization, which opens it for the privileged parts of the society, which there was violence used against them as well, you know, to keep them down so that they don't do anything. But by using this violence, the sections of the society that was resisting, it's like, you know, when you do a projector on a rabbit, you know, like you paralyze them with violence. You paralyze them, you know. And this is what they've done in Turkey. And of course, the whole world was silent. Anyone, without exception. We did not make the same noise as we did for Rojava. It's understandable why superpowers do this, you know, because they didn't want the Kurdish freedom movement to be strong. They didn't want this Soviet potentiality to come through at its maximum. So what they did was they agreed that the Kurdish freedom movement can be wiped out at any cost, at any human cost, in north of Kurdistan. Even UNESCO, you know, the Sur in Ahmed, Diyarbakir, very old place, was declared just a month or two ago to be in the World Heritage List. UNESCO didn't say anything. The whole place is destroyed. Of course, the idea was to leave Rojava isolated, because Rojava at the end became what it is together with what is happening in north of Kurdistan. When Kobani, Erdogan was screaming from the border, it's falling, it fell, people from north of Kurdistan just ran into Kobani to keep it alive. You can see the footage on YouTube if you just punch in a few, you know, of these sentences in there. You can see that. So they saw that this is a no good idea. You know, in North Kurdistan, the movement is very strong. And during talks in Turkey with Öcalan, they opened really the Pandora's box. I mean, in Europe, you know, people talk about coming out of closet for gays and lesbians. In Turkey, coming out of closet is for different beliefs and ethnicities. people came out of their closet. You know, they said, I'm a Syrian, I'm Armenian, I'm Roman, I'm this, and, you know, whatever. People came out, and I think they saw the danger of the ideas of Öcalan and how this found shape with HDP and HDK. And they very quickly started to restrict their movements in the different parts of Turkey, because they saw that it's like a hayfire, you know. Like they didn't expect this, and people were getting captivated by the power of these ideas. And so, in April 2015, just as we were hoping for our conference in Hamburg that we would get something directly from Öcalan, just a few days before our conference, they had a press conference, the Turkish state officials, as well as the HDP members of parliament at very high level. And they announced that talks for talks were going ahead, and they did a bit of a signing. Before the ink dried on that signing, Erdogan said, this is not going to work. And I think what they were expecting was that, you know, colonizers somehow think that. You know, that Öcalan is just one of theirs, colonized person. You know, they've colonized him, you know. So they couldn't, they thought that, because during the talks for talks, you know what the Turkish officials used to call him? President. You know? And I think they thought that, you know, Öcalan is just one of the enslaved people of theirs, and that he will just fall for this talk. And what Erdogan tried to get out of him was for Öcalan to say, okay, we're disarming. You know. And instead, Öcalan said, yes, of course we can talk about disarmament, but if you read the roadmap, he says we need to re-talk about security. You know. Now, we need to establish principles for this. You know, we need to take our own internal security to make sure that none of what has been happening to us doesn't happen to us in the future. But yeah, sure, we can talk about disarmament. And if you want me to really convince PKK, I'll go to their next conference and I will talk to them, you know. And so I have to say that there's a trend in the world today that they are trying to disband organizations that are, you know, that are keeping the people together, and they are occupying land. Or not occupying, but like protecting land. You know, like look what's happening after FARC. You know, I mean, the mining factories are, mining companies are going in there. You know, people are being driven out of their homelands, you know, and this is what they wanted us to happen to us in Rojava too. You know, and this is why Afrin, such a small town, is resisting and not going anywhere. Because it's catch-22. You know, you come to Europe, the privileged are screaming because their states are turning them right-wing. You know, they are afraid that they are going to lose their privileges, you know, and there are people and movements who can address that fear and nurture that fear. I mean, where did Trump come from? Where did ISIS come from? You know. They actually address the fears of, let's say, the white-collar workers or white middle class in the US. They nurture from that fear. And in Europe at the moment, for example, I have to say, the left could not come up with a good argumentation of what is happening today and to win people. Instead, at the moment, what we are seeing is that people are being pushed back into the arms of the state, because this is where they are resting their hopes again, you know. So there is such a situation being created all over the world. And I think for that we need much more than just, you know, solidarity in that sense, but which is also important, because I try to show that when Öcalan was abducted, if the Kurdish people all over the world did not go out onto the street, we wouldn't have stopped the course of history. We have to see that our actions have a result. You know, our actions attain results. And we Kurds know this, you know. And sometimes people say, you know, when we say, okay, we're going to do this, and you know, we're always on the street, bloody hell. And sometimes when things are cool, Kurds say, Hevel, like it's like comrade, you know. Do you think it's like it has some kind of a benefit when we're out on the street? You know? But then, when it's critical times, they see that it has, of course. During Kobani it had, during 1999 it had, during Afrin it has, etc. And I want to talk a little bit, before I finish off, about what's happening in the prisons in Turkey, and a little bit on Öcalan as well. I think in today's, let me start with the prisons, and then I'll go to Öcalan through the prisons as well. Imrali Island prison is like a European Guantanamo, or Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela stayed. You can think of it like that. A good friend of mine says you can understand the influence and strength of ideas by the way people are imprisoned. You know, how far they are off the main island. And if that's not enough, they are under isolation, you know. Öcalan has been on this island for the past 19 years, as Dimitri has pointed out. Until 2009, he was the only person on that island, only civilian. This island has been a military zone. It was not under the Ministry of Justice until recently, and that's seemingly. We're not sure if that is really the case. There's been more than 1,000 soldiers, guardians, personnel, and etc. guarding the island. It has a radius of air and land and waterways that it's off limits, you know. Until 2009, he was alone, and then 5 people were brought in there. On and off, there's been severe isolation conditions imposed. Most of those times, when there's severe isolation conditions, there has been huge wars between the Kurdish freedom movement and the Turkish state. When the isolation has been removed, there's been usually talks for talks. It's interesting, isn't it? Somebody should actually go and research this, and this book is actually a good showing of that as well, I think. So, and since 2011, Öcalan has not met a single lawyer. This is happening in Europe. Turkey is a member of Council of Europe forever, you know. And we understand that this is not only Turkey's responsibility from the fact that nobody is showing any reaction to us. No Amnesty International, no Human Rights Watch, no CPT, no nobody. You know, nobody's saying, hey guys, you can't do this. You can't hold a guy in there and not have a lawyer visit him for how many years now? 2011, 7 or 8 years, you know. Since April 2015, the MPs are not allowed to go in there either. On the contrary, they are now arrested themselves, you know. And I have to give an anecdote. Öcalan was really adamant that the Turkish parliament passes a law. He said, because he said, if these talks fail, you know, he said to the MPs, you're going to be charged with treason. So he said, I won't do these talks unless you pass a law protecting these poor souls. And, you know, so something like that was passed through, although they are not charged for treason, not yet at least, you know, but they are in there. And for what reason, nobody knows as yet. And so, ever since April 2015, nobody was able to see him until a hunger strike began in Diyarbakir, Ahmed, and they demanded that they wanted to see Öcalan, and this was after the attempted coup when there was news that a helicopter full of army personnel wanted to go there and perhaps kill him or abduct him or whatever. So as a result, his brother was able to go for half an hour in September 2016. And since then, we have no communication with anyone on that island. So we have no idea what is going on. I tend to think that the Turkish state at the moment does not say anything negative or positive about Öcalan. You know, before they used to say the baby killer, the terrorist, and this used to really touch us. You know, we used to say, "Ooh, you can't say this." And they've understood this. Now they're not saying anything. You know, one reason is not to get us all boiled up because they're not saying anything bad. The second reason is to push his ideas out of our seeing, you know. And so this is how they're trying to use this, I think. And of course, the intellectual world outside of Turkey, as David Graeber has recently admitted in one of his articles, don't know what to do with these ideas. Because it's interdisciplinary, it can't be categorized to only that. He takes a holistic approach. And, you know, in today's world, we have two kinds of intellectualism. One is to prepare to go into the bureaucracy, you know, and the other one is like critical studies, but that's also very much compartmented. So, till this moment, nobody has actually taken these, you know, serious intellectual people, have taken these things into proper study or understanding. Although it's developing, of course, let me tell you that. So the idea here and the power of his ideas come from a fact that as you get involved, you get liberated. It's an interesting way of doing because nothing is actually predetermined. Even in his writings, even in the doings of the community, nothing is predetermined. The only predetermined thing is that exploitation is off grounds and there is no private relationship. Öcalan says that the worst of exploitation and oppression happens in the most private relationships, and that of men and women. And this is mimicked in every facet of our lives. And therefore, the power of this revolution is in the fact that it organizes all the different parts of society who are traditionally oppressed and exploited, women, for example. So the power of our organization is not the fact that we have councils. No, everybody has councils. The power is not that we have, you know, co-mayors, one woman and woman, one man and woman. The power is that that woman is not there alone. She comes with a huge network of organization behind her. And we know, and Öcalan calls the state the most institutionalized male. The male is already organized. So the male is not in any organization, you know. And Öcalan calls on the men, and everybody's baffled with this, because everybody sees him as a patriarch, you know, Öcalan. Not everyone, but some. And Öcalan calls on the men to kill the dominant male inside them. He doesn't just call on the woman to, you know, like empower yourselves, free yourselves, and whatever. He turns around to the man and says, you free yourself as well. You're not as free as you think you are, you know. And this is the power of the ideas. Actually, I think what he's doing is by calling the enslavement of women or women herself as the first nation, class, and colony, he is replacing what is there for class, you know, the working class, with women, but in a more extensive way, not on a superficial manner. And he is thus going back into history to understand how this enslavement and how this turning around of relationship occurred. And this is why you will find in his books here one of the most comprehensive, and he has 13 books in prison and 60 all in all. Maybe to call it books is a bit deceptive because they are not written as books. You know, he's written them as his submissions to various courts, mostly to the Court of Human Rights. And he's critiqued the Court of Human Rights, saying, you know, I only have a chance to do an individual application and an individual defense, but my crime is not that of an individual. You know, where do I go? There's nowhere to go because this is a system of nations with a state. So you have nowhere to go. So he says, I'm not going to do an individual defense. And he's actually called one of his books, In Defense of a People. So you will see a humongous corpus of a post-colonial history of not only Mesopotamia, but of peoples. And the universality of his ideas lie there. The starting point may have been Kurds, but where we have come is, you know, it's just gone beyond that. It's become a history of peoples and women. And you will see in this purple brochure that he makes an attempt at that, to write also, or to expose the history of women and her loss of freedom. And so this is the synergy, the energy, you know, behind the dynamism. Because everyone, as I said, all the exploited are organized in such a way to come out and to redefine themselves. Now, the Kurdish women are discussing genealogy, which is called the science of women. It's so dynamic, you know, I mean, he's the person to have suggested this name. And it's so dynamic that, you know, women are discussing now how they want to define themselves. What is the definition of a woman? You know, is it enough to have breasts to be a woman? You know, how do we define a woman? How do we define a man? How does woman define a man? You know, so these are all discussions that goes along with this warfare. It is not just war that is going on in Rojava, in Bakur. It's not. It is not just about the existence of the Kurdish people. Those lands are the lands of women's times, you know. So it's also a past memory of ours that are under attack. And there's an effort of homogenization. So therefore, you know, the youth, Armenians, Assyrians, Alevis, Yazidis, you know, I don't know what, all of them organizing themselves, not only on Yazidi belief, but also Yazidi women organizing themselves, is allowing the progressive parts of all these different philosophies, ideologies, you know, to develop. So it's creating a huge dynamism for everybody, you know. And this is why people are smiling under the worst conditions that we know of. And this is why people are not destitute. They are not acting like a victim. Under the worst conditions and under the attack of all forces that we know, regional and global. And people are saying that it is time, and we've named our latest campaign like that, the time has come for Öcalan's freedom and that of all peoples. And we can only do this together. It cannot happen in pockets. So therefore, your struggle, your stance here strengthens our struggle and our stance there. Because just like man is organized all over the world, intuitively, you know, these fascists are also organized all around the world. And no matter what PR they do, they are doing all the crap there together. All the war crimes and crimes against humanity. But we are also creating. So this is, you know, we have to concentrate on this part. Of course, they are not going to hand over our freedoms on a golden platter. You know, so they are using all the might they have to make us retreat. You know, but this is the time. The time has come. Our freedom is within our reach. Thank you.
Havin, of course, is the translator of Öcalan's many writings. And you will find many of his writings there. I consider Öcalan a universal genius, and his life reminds me of the life of another universal genius, whose name is Murray Bookchin. There are quite similarities between their biographies, although Murray never wound up in prison. But in terms of ideas, there's an interesting interplay between them. And so I want now to invite you to ask what you have in your heart and your mind, because we have this exceptional opportunity here to really get into the subject matter. And I want to really stress that ideas are important and books are important. And self-education is important. And that's what we're trying to experience here all together. So whose hand is going to shoot up first? You.
Yes.
Stand up so we can hear you.
Can I ask my question in French? Someone can translate it.
Can we get a volunteer to translate? Sorry, you can do it?
Go ahead.
You translate?
No, no. Can we get a volunteer who's bilingual to
I can
just?
help translate.
Okay.
Well, I can try in English.
Do it in French if you're more comfortable. If it's...
Dis-les en français, on va traduire.
Allez, allez.
Question d'ordre
Posez la
question d'ordre
question.
général,
À
en fait,
Montréal, on pose la question en français.
Dans la présentation, vous avez mis vous avez parlé de la situation spécifique du mouvement kurde dans sa tension entre les socialistes et les nationalistes. Je me demandais, ça serait quoi, à la fois dans l'expérience de résistance du peuple kurde et ses alliés et dans la pensée de Öcalan, c'est quoi les avancées par rapport au marxisme des années 70-80?
That was a huge chunk. So, in what you put forth and all your ideas.
Just can you see, if you're going to play translator, you have to stand up so we can hear you. Thank you.
You spoke about the nationalists and the socialists and their relationships within the Kurdish struggle, and you would like to make more of a parallel with Marxist ideas and Marxist struggles, if you could speak to that. And I'm probably
Okay, so that's question number one. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions, d'autres commentaires?
Yeah, but it goes
On a
further.
pen and no.
He also wants to know how this advances the struggle with Marxism and the development of. That's what he said also.
Anybody else? We're going to take a couple of questions at a time, okay? Who else?
And comments as well, comments.
Reality from what I understand, and I'm just appalled and thinking this, how can we get a good base to help and support you when the information is wrong that's going out? So it's like...
That's a hard question, and it's an internal question, but I also
I know,
have
but
to
it's just
say,
reflections on what
I
you
also
see.
have to say that Havin was recently on CTV at a major program that Donald managed to arrange, and she completely enchanted the TV anchor who received her. So she has an open invitation.
I did nothing. She was ready. I mean, she was
She has
already
an open
enchanted.
invitation to be on this program on CTV anytime she
Wonderful.
comes back to Montreal, so we have to bring her back to Montreal.
We need Havin show, weekly
And
Havin show on
and
CTV.
the other question is back there, or comment is back there, so let's do that.
I was just wondering what the role of Canada is in Syria, because at one point they were helping find targets for the USA to bomb. I don't know if that's still going on.
Sure it is.
Did you understand that, Evan?
Yeah.
Okay, so you go. Why don't you do that?
There's
Just a
too much.
moment. I'm Cherry. Keep quiet.
I just want to add
Go ahead, Havin.
something of the same question. All the time when I present my movie, people ask me how we can help, and I never know what to say and what to suggest. So if you can help me with that, and
Good.
it was really
Okay,
a lot of information. Thank you.
let's go.
Okay, it's a mixed questions here. As I said, Öcalan started off as a Marxist-Leninist, and this was a big no-no back those days, because being a Kurd was bad enough in the two-poled world where you had the Soviet Union, and the USA, and in Turkey especially, being a leftist and a Marxist-Leninist is very was difficult at the time as well during the Cold War. So being then a Kurdish freedom movement which is Marxist-Leninist was really the pits of it all. Now, Öcalan is of course is discussing Marxism at quite a length in his books. And he's critiquing it quite a bit as well, And the critique is especially because he finds Marxism to be very Eurocentric, for once. And he sees it, he critiques Marxist way of looking at history, very linear, He makes use of these categories of slave-owned society, feudalism, and all that. But he sees it more as an overlapping situation, that it's overlapped. One doesn't finish and the other begins. He doesn't see it in that way. And he kind of doesn't like it that working class is elevated to a level where it's as if, it's a privilege to be a working class. He says, on the contrary, we should really try not to become a working class. So therefore, there are, some different perspectives on looking at things. And in that sense, too, like I think maybe with Mari Bookchin, too, maybe there's a difference there. The way he puts women's loss of freedom and women's revolution at the center of how things began to go wrong is completely different in that sense. And it differs from feminism as well, because it doesn't just look at it from the gender point of view. He sees this as the beginning of loss of freedom for men and for the whole society. And this is why he's actually able to attract the Kurdish male to have some interest in this. So the struggle is not like your enemies towards one another, because he's able to show the men too that it's their freedom is enhanced. They will attain freedom through this as well. So these are some of the differences, and there are many more. But I would really suggest that you read the books for that. Otherwise, maybe we can do a whole discussion on that, because, as I said, there are many other different points, but this is just to start one. Another is, of course, as much as Das Kapital is a very important work, and Öcalan gives that, but he says there's too much elevation and concentration. And maybe because of the time in which he wrote it, that it arose, that he delved into this point so much. but it's almost to a point where it gives it too much credit. You know, so he's critical on a few fronts. On the front of the approach, the practical approach on the ground to state, he's very critical as well. He's critical of the Leninist party model, which the PKK had also adopted, had adopted,
Yeah.
and it's still trying to, you know, it's still in transition, because it only changes with a change in people. You know, so we were talking today that you shouldn't think of Rojava to be everything is done, finished, you know, let's pack our stuff, go home. It's not like that. It's still a mixed bag of things, and it's a struggle of every day. You know, it's a revolution of moments. You know, this is why council meetings are very important. This is why it's important that people come there organized. You know, otherwise, like a friend of mine in the Barcelona commune said, we get a headache when we go to the meetings, you know, and the reason for that is, you know, people are not coming in an organized way to those meetings. Our meetings don't go like that, you know, because we've done the discussions before we come there. In our groups, like the woman has done it, they have a position, you know, the youth has done it, they have a position, so you come there and all the different groups express why such a particular decision is not good to take from where they are standing, you know. And so therefore, what you have there is not a, you know, lots of, you know, a discussion of not on the right path, but a discussion that will give a fruit. So, these are, you know, some of the stuff. Canada. I really don't know what to say of Canada. I mean,
Anywhere. How
I'm going
through?
Okay. The way I used to see it, and I had never come to Canada, I thought, my God, you know, the Prime Minister had such a cabinet. You'd think he's doing democratic confederalism. You know, I mean, in the ministry there was a sheikh, there was, you know, indigenous, there were women. He's himself very young. You know, wow, you know. But when you're looking at what's happening, you know, this is not it. And I kind of thought, okay, what is going on? Is it an attempt to not allow the energy, the synergy to become, you know, not potential, not potential, but to turn into something? Because if you remember, just before him, there was such an energy. I mean, I dare say, even with Bernie Sanders, you know, in the US, and a little bit of John Corbyn in the UK. Suddenly, the youth got around these people so much, which is good. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is good. He's one of our signatories, I have to tell you, of the international initiative. This is not what I'm saying. He's a good person, you know. But, you know, suddenly, there appeared hope within the system. All of a sudden, in a couple of places. In the centers of capitalist countries. You know? And even Merkel suddenly almost became the champion of human rights or something. At that very short lapse of a time, you know. So I think, you know, we have to be careful how our indigestion is sometimes like taken out of us. No, really, I don't know. Maybe I'm not expressing it properly, you know. And so therefore, you know, at times there are roles given to certain countries around the world. Suddenly Canada was very good to Kurds. You know, we had people come here, which is good, of course, you know. I'm not saying that's bad, you know. So, but apart from that, you know, I can't really say much. Now, what can be done here? I think that you shouldn't relax just because things are not going as bad as it is going in some of the other places. On the contrary, if there is that opening that some good things can be done here, and that area is open, then, you know, instead of saying, oh, you shouldn't do this, you should make use of this, you know, and to organize, and to keep place, and to go to people and explain things, and to network with people. This is very important. I mean, we talked of this in Europe as well. I mean, we could see that, you know, they were preparing the ground to turn people more right-wing, you know. And we have to organize, and we have to make these organizations meet so that they cannot take people away from us, you know, and turn them into right-wing. So I think this is important. So therefore, on the one hand, we cannot feel it's sufficient that we are this many people here, you know. And this is what the CTV, Mushimi was telling me. Mutsumi was telling me. She said, it's great, you know, you're talking, you will be talking to a crowd that will be willing to listen to you. This is good, but this is not enough, you know. And she's right, of course, and this is right for you as well. You know, at a time when everybody is experiencing some kind of a hardship, we cannot, if we believe that we know the way forward, we cannot just keep it to ourselves. We have to find means and ways of communicating with people, you know. A lot of people are either going into depression or, you know, whatever, you know. People are in real hardships in trying to understand what's going on. So I think this is an important responsibility for all of you, you know. And of course, this is internal. But in terms of what is happening on our part of the world, as I said, it's really important to assert pressure from below. Because at the end of the day, no matter how limited the representative democracy is, you can and we can exert pressure there, you know. I mean, we began to do that in Turkey, and they saw that this is going to work, and they just declared martial law. They are now ruling the country with decrees, you know. They are now imposing on people, just like in the 1980s, in the infamous prison of Diyarbakir, now in Rize, in the prison there, they have beaten, tortured people just because they wouldn't get up and sing the national anthem. So it's begun already. They are imposing on people the jumpsuits. And the color of the jumpsuits is like kind of dirty orange, you know. The one used in Guantanamo and the one used by ISIS. And you know, I wondered why Erdogan kept on saying the color is what? The dried, apricot, no. The dried nut. What? Mandel. Almonds. Almonds. And I looked at dried almonds, and some lawyers came from Turkey, and you said, you know what dried almonds color is? It's the color of excrement. Yeah, it's the color of shit. And it will only be imposed at this stage on people to wear it as they go to the court. Not inside the prison, at this moment. Okay? And if they refuse to wear that jumpsuit, and the ones who will refuse to wear it will be the Kurdish and the other left-wing prisoners. Organized prisoners, you know. They will be the ones refusing to wear it. And with one of the last decrees, they passed a law saying, if you do not go to the court once, second time, the court will be able to decide on your behalf without you being there. And then if you don't wear it and if you don't go to court, they will give you, if you don't wear it, they will give you disciplinary punishment, and it will mean that no family visits, no this, no that. So a string of stuff is going to come up. But let me tell you, I mean, this is not a fight that has to be done bit by bit on little fronts, you know. I mean, the only way, because we are at such a moment in history, it is really, I mean, we are living a historical moment, you know. I don't know, I feel like that we are going through such a historical moment. Maybe we will understand it 50 years down the lane or something. But you know, this is the decisive time when next century, the regime of next century is being decided. And I feel proud to belong to a region and to a people who are struggling to make sure that that century is the century of freedom for women and peoples. Thank you.
I'll tell you an interesting anecdote. When I was in Istanbul, we were hosted in part by two legal cabinets, two cabinets of lawyers. And at one meeting, we talked very carefully and very detailed the consequences of Öcalan being in jail on Imrali and what it could mean and what's going on. And we couldn't find out, of course, what's going on. And this cabinet of lawyers, there were 12 around the table, they said to us, well, we tried to get lawyers to go and see him, but they don't allow lawyers to go and see him. So we decided to hold a demonstration. Now listen to this. 200 lawyers from Istanbul went and had a demonstration in the harbor of the city to get on boats for all of them to go to Imrali. 200 lawyers. But the naval authorities, the harbor authorities, announced that particular day that none of the ferry boats were really functioning, and they had broken down equipment and they couldn't possibly take all of these lawyers to Imrali. I mean, the Turkish state uses every possible trick to prevent things from really developing and unfolding. It's devious. But even that is not working because, as you know, and as this book illustrates, there are thousands of people in jail. Thousands. Thousands. So we have to do something about it. And we have to kick a lot of ass in Ottawa especially, that they sit there and, you know, I speak from personal experience. Nathan and I lobbied Canadian senators, Canadian members of parliament of all three political parties. We gave them a copy of this massive, highly documented report that our delegation put together. They all nodded their heads, and they all said this, that, and the other thing, but they do nothing. They do nothing. They are afraid to open up their mouth. And we know that the Turkish students who, the first thing that we did, we were welcomed by a group of Turkish students when we went to Ottawa before we started lobbying. And each one of those Turkish students said, the Turkish embassy watches us. And they come to the university and they do all sorts of things to prevent us from being politically active. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It reminded me of the days when there was a dictatorship in Athens, the junta, the infamous military junta. They used to go around all the Greek restaurants to prevent the playing of Theodorakis' music. I mean, they just do everything to hold us back. So we have a real challenge in front of us, and I think we could do it. Please, anybody else?
Let me just say what can be done. I think I didn't really say something sufficient to that. Now, in the UK, the trade unions have taken up this issue at a large scale. Now, this is important. This is how they did it with Nelson Mandela, when they embraced him and they turned his name into almost a household name, that everybody knew him and everybody actually demanded his freedom. Everybody understood that it was about time. For example, even small things like, you know, there is the Table Mountains in South Africa. People apparently used to go there and used to tell out loud, can you take a photo of me with Robben Island at the back? You know, when the apartheid regime saw that this was happening, they saw that it was impossible to keep it under covers anymore. So, you know, we have to find means and ways, especially trade unions, especially, you know, other, like Human Rights Watch, and I know what they are, you know, but like Amnesty International, mass movements to own up to this, to embrace this, to do postcards to the Human Rights Committee here, you know, to push the Canadian government to ask Turkey about what is happening at the Imrali Island prison. You know, we've had states do this, like the Norwegian government actually did this several times, asking Turkey what's happening at the Imrali Island prison, you know. So, I mean, these bits and small bits and pieces, when they come together, they make people realize that they can't have a free reign. They can only have a free reign when nobody cares, you know. When the voices come up, for example, in Italy, Öcalan is given honorary membership by different municipalities, for example, you know. So these bits and pieces are very, very important. And it is actually left your creativity, because you would know what can be possible in Canada, you know. Maybe municipalities cannot give honorary citizenships here. I don't know this.
They do. They're given on to Mandela.
Yeah. So, and then you can name streets, you know, or do other things that can actually strengthen the voice to be heard.
Yeah. For example, not everything is bleak. Like, we have to not forget that the National Assembly here in Quebec, thanks to the initiative of a handful of very hard-working people, passed a unanimous resolution condemning human rights abuses in Turkey. This is the only legislative body in all of North America that passed such a resolution. That is quite something. And of course, the point of having them pass a resolution is to influence what goddamn Ottawa is not doing. You understand what I'm saying? But there is a work to be done with the trade unions. There are 3 major trade unions in Quebec. And there are all sorts of people who pretend who are leftists in this audience. Why aren't our trade unions doing anything? Why aren't our trade unions doing anything?
Because they're
Speaking
feudalized
up.
to the state, my friend.
Okay?
They're not
so we
doing
have
anything.
work to do there also.
I know.
So please,
Sorry.
John, you had your hand up.
I'm not very well informed in this, so I might go all the way off base in asking, did the pressure, as I understand it, the Kurdish peoples in 4 different countries have come together and declared a state, declared a unity. I want to know if that came from the people, from the base, or if that was a policy of the councils of higher authority. I also wanted to know how you respond to Israel's backing of that group. I think there was only one country in the world which affirmed that unification of the Kurdish groups in 4 countries. Israel was on side for that. And I ask it because that declaration of unity, if I'm correct about it, in 4 states, 4 nations, which are either extreme, as Turkey is with its human rights abuses, or destabilized, as Iraq is, and Syria, extremely, then they are not really within the purview of human action toward each other as much. It's not a norm. They're highly destabilized areas, so it puts the Turkish community in 4 countries at risk. And that's my question, really. That's an impression I have, and if you can shed light on it, I'd appreciate it.
Any other interventions, any other comments or questions?
Okay, actually that referendum was only held in South Kurdistan, which is north of Iraq. And it was a referendum to see, it wasn't a referendum for independence. It wasn't even that far, you know. It was a referendum to see if the people wanted independence of an independent state. So it didn't actually encompass 4 parts of Kurdistan at all. Because for South Kurdistan, the KDP, which is the Democratic Party of Kurdistan, and its leader is Mesut Barzani, for him the only Kurdistan is South Kurdistan, you know, and he calls it the Kurdistan anyway, you know. The situation with Israel is, of course, very complicated. And saying that, just before Öcalan was pushed out of Syria on 9th of October 1998, 2 years before, Israel and Turkey entered into a strategic alliance in an agreement. And in 1998, just before Öcalan there was pressure exerted by Turkey naval ships, warships going into the seas of Syria and etc., you know, everybody backing them, whatever, including Israel. Öcalan said, Israel sent me an envoy. You know, there is still nothing about Öcalan leaving Syria as yet. He says, there's an envoy sent to me by Israel asking me to accept patronage of Israel on the Kurdish question. And he says, neither I found it ethically nor politically correct to accept that. And shortly after, all this, you know, tensions were created, and Öcalan was pushed out of Syria. And only 11 or 12 days after this, 9th of October, I think it was 20th or so of October, the same year, there was an Adana agreement between Syria and Turkey where they became bodies, you know. So in fact, the ordeal that fell on Öcalan fell because he did not accept the plans that were to come, that were foreseen for the Middle East. He didn't agree with this. And that disagreement continues, you know, and we are put through hell to make sure that we comply by this. And at the time, when Öcalan was in Italy, it was these political parties, Kurdish, they went with their folders at hand to show how much of a terrorist was Öcalan and the PKK. It was again these parties who in Rojava tried to break the revolution there by complicating issues and confusing the people as to what's happening. It was again these parties who opened South Kurdistan to the petite bourgeoisie that was to be nurtured from the Kurds in Turkey and for them to grow in South Kurdistan, so that when the time came, there wouldn't be enough people to rise up because they had too much to lose. So it's a plan within a plan, you know. So I realize, just as I don't know the Canadian politics at all, I know very, very rough lines, I understand that the Kurds can be lump summed together as well, but this is not the case. And the way that